All right. Good morning, everyone. Very good morning to you, or good evening, or good afternoon, depending on when you're watching this. If you're here with us live, thank you very much for watching the replay. Welcome to the program. My name is Ramanyang. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Over the next hour, we'll have a conversation exploring in some detail, right, how essentially we're going to be able to scale global operations for the business process outsourcing industry based right here in Kenya. As you'll hear over the next hour from a fantastic panel of speakers, this is one of the more interesting, fast-growing markets in this particular space. Kenya's arguably one of the more emerging markets. Of course, we've got competitors around the continent who are slightly more mature, shall we say. But as we've just seen in the last 60 seconds in those introductory videos that we did roll, there are a lot of opportunities and advantages to setting up shop right here in Kenya. The question, of course, is how do you take advantage of them? And of course, scale from that point forward. I've got two fantastic panelists who've been in this business for quite a while who'll walk us through this conversation for the next 60 minutes or thereabouts. And of course, if you've got questions and comments that you'd like to put to our panelists, please put them down using the Q&A function right at the bottom of your screen. We'll certainly be looking at those, and the team from the Two Rivers International Finance and Innovation Center, of course, will also be looking at that in some detail, and we'll get to those as soon as we can. Let me introduce you to our speakers for today. We're joined by Sven Dakota, who's the CEO of Teleperformance here in Kenya, and Jonathan Beasley, who's the Program Director at Genesis. Gentlemen, if you could introduce yourselves to our audience very briefly and give us a 60-second pitch of how did you get into this space and what's exciting for you about it? As
Yeah,
there
I
you
will start. Thank you.
go.
So thank you for the introduction, Rama. My name is Sven. I've been in Kenya for the last 5 years with our BPO association, and the exciting part is of the great potential of growth and the trajectory of the industry in the African continent in general. So for myself, looking forward to this discussion and engaging and see how and what needs to be done to drive this forward.
Jonathan, your turn.
Yeah, thanks, Rama. So I got into this space about 10 years ago. I was in technology startups in New York for a long time. And then I was approached by Mark Sears, who founded Cloud Factory in Asia. And he really wanted to scale up in Africa. And we chose Kenya and ended up growing that business to a few thousand people just in Kenya. Interestingly, that business is a little more focused on what I would call AI data services versus customer experience or CX, which is what Teleperformance is known for. And you can see that there's a variety of companies that are thriving in Kenya, but also across Africa. I now am program director for our digital livelihoods practice at Genesis Analytics, and that's basically trying to unlock jobs, to put it very simply, trying to unlock digital jobs across the continent. But specifically in those 8 or 10 African countries that are either mature or right on the cusp of having billion-dollar industries in Africa.
All right, perfect. Sven, I want to start with you because, from your vantage point at Teleperformance, it's, when I sit back and I look at what sort of investors are coming into economies on the continent, we've had individuals talking about the, business process outsourcing for quite a few years now. But what is the attraction for investing in African economies, especially where we are now in Kenya? Is it a location issue? Is it a policy issue? Is it the tech and the depth of talent that's available?
So I would say definitely it's the people. I think the people, and for us, if we are looking at the English level speaking, is for very good grading. So I think the capability of good recruitment and high quality of talent within the African continent is the main attraction for us. As we say, our industry is fast growing, fast expansion, so there always needs to be a reliable pipeline of available talent. On top of that, I think we are seeing the global BPO sector looking for alternatives to the main hubs in the world, i.e. India, the Philippines, and those are all English-speaking hubs. So where is the big next English speaking hub? And if we then look at the scale of English efficiency, the continent has got really some pockets that are very interesting to tap into and cause opportunity for investment, of course.
Indeed, and you can actually see the value proposition there from our colleagues, of course, at TRIFIC, the Tariva's International Financial Center. Jonathan, with respect to Africa being on the radar now, I know you mentioned a little earlier. There's some markets that are a bit more mature than others. Walk us through that lay of the land and where the growth opportunity from your perspective is strongest.
Sure, sure. Yeah, and this is actually a Genesis slide that's up here right now. I mean, the countries on this slide are there, for a reason, right? So you have I would say 3 to 5 mature tech outsourcing destinations. You have South Africa, you have Egypt, you have Morocco. Mauritius is quite mature, as well. And then you have and those are all above, aside from Mauritius, they punch above their weight, right? But it's a small country. All those, South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, they're all above $3 billion in terms of revenue. But to level set the opportunity, there's just over 1 million people working in the industry on the continent. There's about 2 million people just in the Philippines. Okay, Philippines is a country of just over 100 million people, and they, again, they have 2 million people working in this industry. A lot of them in customer experience, but the continent has some emerging players like Ghana, like Kenya, like Nigeria, Rwanda. Again, a country that punches above its weight, has done a fantastic job in just aligning incentives with global demand and having tax benefits and that kind of stuff. So they're doing quite well. And Africa's growing at a higher rate than the outsourcing industry globally, right? So the outsourcing industry as a whole, even with AI and so forth, is still forecast to grow at like 8% compound annual growth rate, whereas Africa, most of the countries I mentioned are 10% plus. Kenya is at 18. And those are some big numbers. If you're looking at it from, there's a lot of different kinds of investors in this space. And of course, we can't forget that really the space should be an opportunity for youth. But there's opportunities everywhere you look. And of course, there's also challenges, but we'll talk about that. But yeah, that gives you a quick run through of the African landscape in relation to the global market, which the global market is about $1.2 to $1.5 trillion. And Africa currently captures about 3% of that.
Indeed. So there's plenty of headroom to grow there. And, just for comparison's sake for our audience online, the Philippines population of about 100 million people, that's comparable to Egypt, which is about the same, if not slightly more. Ethiopia, arguably same sort of population size as well. But I want to get back to the competitiveness question, right? Because if we're essentially saying, look, we're going to compete against India, we're going to compete against the Philippines, and we're trying to attract businesses to come here on both ends of the market, right? So customer operations, user experience issues, back office operations as well. From your perspective, what's our competitive edge, right, to set up here in Kenya?
I think the competitive edge is, of course, the time zone, the cost, the cost benefit impact, and the capability. I think that is the main points. As long as we can control cost and we can provide the talent, we have a great proposition.
Yeah, I just had them pop this up too. I mean, in about 20 years, Africa will be the only continent in the world that has a growing working age population, right? In about like half of the world's working age population, and by 2050 will be African. And so when you think about the talent shortages that the global north is already experiencing, the average age in Germany is whatever, 45, 46. The average age in Kenya is 19 years old. If we can coordinate the ecosystem so that we're actually training on doing demand-led training versus just kind of, pointing a finger in the air and hoping for the best. This sort of mentality of skilling and the jobs will come. Well, you have to skill in the right things, and you have to get, I would say, crucially, work experience, whether that's simulated or otherwise. People have to have that, that basket of soft skills where they're workforce ready. But back to the, why Africa? The attrition rates are getting really crazy in Asia. It's tough to you'll interview 100 people for a job in India, and half of them will maybe say they're going to accept, and then they get a job down the street, right? So it's in Kenya, in places that are less saturated, like Ghana or Nigeria especially, you don't see those kinds of attrition rates. There's also this really, really interesting opportunity, to set forth your brand amongst youth, amongst your employer value proposition, right? You can be known as one of the best employers versus swimming in a saturated market where you're one of literally, I think I heard the other day, just talking about a heavy BPO city, and 20 BPOs opened in the last year, one city alone. It's like that's just not the case, right? In Kenya, you can almost own a neighborhood if you come to Kenya now and draw from Anyway, I'm talking about Kenya a lot, but that's where I'm based. The same is true in if you wanted to open up in Abuja or in Accra, that's still pretty unsaturated. Um,
With
yeah, so
respect,
I think cost and quality is what it always comes down to, right? But anyway, go ahead.
yeah, with the question of talent development, because we're in an environment now where the tech and I'm pretty sure it's the same. We're seeing this in finance, we're seeing this in my industry, in the media as well. There was this fascinating story out of Australia. I believe it was reported by The Verge sometime last week that a station that had run this experiment where basically they had, I think it was an afternoon show being run literally by an AI presenter for months, and no one had absolutely noticed. And tech is changing both the sort of jobs that are available and the way we do work at an accelerated pace. Is that the same thing that you're seeing in your industry? And if so, how do you train talent, right, to adapt to that sort of environment where things are changing, constantly? What worked in 2024 may not necessarily work in 2025.
Yeah, I think for me, and we had a brief discussion before this, Rama, and I think AI is one of these topics that keeps popping up. And ourselves in our industry have been using AI in the last 10 years. How do we skill and how do we train talent moving forward is more the question. I think that comes back to the point that JB was making, is we need to prepare and we need to plan the future. We need to not just look at where are we now, where will we be in 5 or 10 years. So I think the development and the deployment of AI will continue. I think more important, as I said, is EI, emotional intelligence. How do we develop the staff coming in and collaborating with the AI and being able to synergize both together is for us a crucial topic for the moment.
Indeed. Any thoughts on this, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'll go back to the demand-led, you know, trope. There are, the best way to be keyed into to things in real time is to be responding to global customer demand. And so the more global businesses that are on the continent, the training will naturally follow from that because everyone's incentivized in the right way. Um, in the absence of that, and look, I do think that the industry is going to continue to grow at 15-20% year over year. But of course, we have TVETs on the continent. Digital pedagogy is always being looked at, but it's not really aligned with global demand. But that being said, there's an enormous amount of both for-profit and nonprofit training programs that exist out there that are getting better and better at scraping LinkedIn for what are the skills and job types in real time that global companies are hiring for. So again, the best way to stay on track is to, if you're not in a work environment, simulate it, know what people are hiring for, etc. I don't think we can afford anymore to, to not train on things that are not monetizable, with the youth explosion that we have. Yeah.
Indeed. I just want to look back to this specific slide that you have at the moment, that's up on the screen now. Looking at BPO revenues by country, and in terms of where that revenue is coming from, I'm a little curious to explore that a bit more because if you say we're growing at 18%, yes, there are all these demographic problems that are happening now in the global north, but if we have this conversation 5, 10, maybe 15 years down the line, where's our primary client base going to come from? Is it still going to be driven by firms based in the global north, or are we going to start seeing a shift towards more firms in Asia, in India, China, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, one important thing to know about this too is that these revenues they take into account domestic demand as well. That's coming that's coming inside of South Africa. South Africa in particular, they have a very coordinated market. They have organizations like the Collective X that does demand-led training. They have a really strong outsourcing association. So they have domestic demand that's quite high. The only country in Africa where the international demand is higher than domestic is Egypt. But of course, if you look at how do these markets mature, what's that maturation cycle look like in the Philippines or India? India has a huge domestic market too, but it's going to be coming more from international demand. In Africa, Africa is extraordinarily well positioned to service European, EU, UK, and the US. And there are certain things like cultural affinity, language, and just demographics that are just make such a strong case. So the growth is going to come, and also the wage growth for young people is going to come from companies either global companies like Wipro, Infosys, Concentrix, coming in and setting up shop. That's certainly one way, or local operators getting up to snuff in terms of, we're ISO certified, our InfoSec policies align with GDPR, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of that stuff needs to happen. So, with whatever it is, the 100 million jobs that are necessary, it's more than that, right? We only have 1 million people in the industry now. So it'll be a combination. And yeah, it's exciting across a lot of variety of different job types as well, from customer experience all the way up to like software dev, DevOps, cybersecurity. Like the opportunities are endless, but you have to be up to those international standards to tap into international demand.
Indeed. We've sort of jumped a little bit into the challenges question a little bit, but before that, just want to pedal us back. Uh, Dealing with the question of, real life examples of firms that have actually delivered some interesting results, working with, Teleperformance or Genesis as it might be, to essentially, outsource some of the operations here in Africa, because there's got to be some really fun stories out there. So Sven, start us off. What are
Yeah.
some ones that stand out for you?
So I think for us, of course, we work with with US clients. I think the development of the talent is the fun stories. If we see, for example, UK, European markets, we can serve Denmark and Finland and Norway from Kenya. And that is now, of course, through digital tools. So developing the skills and getting people learned and up to speed on that trajectory is the nice part. Other stories are, of course, we're looking at how are we growing the business from a client perspective? What is the engagement? What is the participation? It is a journey. As I said, we started in 2020, and it really exploded. So it's a good thing for us as well from a working population perspective, because we grow internally. So people that started in 2020 have moved on in their careers with us or grown externally. So I think the BPO industry is one of those industries that is a real jumping board for either a career in our industry or a jumping board out external. Yeah. So I think that is the exciting part for the development of our industry in Africa. What is the career plan of each individual and how do you move on to that?
Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean everywhere you look across the continent, it seems there are really good stories. I'll just point out a few that stick out that are more homegrown. So you have a company called InGen, which is in Ghana, and they train like cloud engineers, machine learning engineers, and then actually have them work on projects in Switzerland and Germany and so forth. And they're out of Accra. And they're just hyper connected into the demand source there in Northern Europe, which is quite an accomplishment. You have tech experts. They have 2,000 people doing technical support, managed services out of Rwanda, Nigeria, outsourced global in Nigeria and Abuja, similar. Hard to ignore CCI. CCI it has just grown by leaps and bounds across with a very, 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 they doubled down very, very early on Africa, as opposed to having, centers in Asia or in Latin America. And then, look, I think if you're sitting in Kenya, and Kenya already has, if you drive around Nairobi, you can see Microsoft and Oracle, and, Google's here and all that. But like in South Africa, you have huge enterprise setups, what would be considered to be truly global business services, meaning they're able to take huge chunks of managed services off of companies' plates. AWS, BMW, Lufthansa, Capgemini just opened an AI center of excellence in Egypt. Um, Microsoft just opened $1 billion data center in Kenya. And so, you'll in 17 or something like 17 out of the top 25, I believe, systems integrators are already on the continent, but they're clustered in Egypt, Morocco, and South Africa. And so you can see where it's going in terms of Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Rwanda, that middle section of countries. You'll start to see large setups like that too. So it's a combination of things, but it's also, I would say, and more to the challenges point, it's also going to be in Nairobi and Accra and Lagos, right? It's not, yeah, it's not going to be in the rural areas, and so a lot of infrastructure challenges outside of capital cities, but inside capital cities, because of the population and because the infrastructure is there, the opportunity is really massive.
Uh, and I want to jump into the challenges question because, stepping back and just looking at the continent as a whole, one of the things, I often hear when we're talking to enterprises, to governments is twofold. There's always a problem around infrastructure. So in terms of energy, for example, energy access, energy availability, that's usually a big concern. Um, Internet access, internet connectivity has improved quite a bit over the last decade, but relative, to the global north, I think there's still a fair bit of work to do there. From your perspective, Sven, what are the main challenges that you run into, right, in trying to scale, to meet, if you're going to go from that 1 million jobs that we have now in the sector all the way to the next 2 million, the next 3 million? We've got to fix some of these problems on infrastructure, especially on energy and data and others, don't we?
Yeah, so I think the main point would here be infrastructure. And I know we have just taken space at Triffic, which is, of course, very exciting. But the development of suitable infrastructure for our industry, I think, is one of the next steps. On power and electricity supply, of course, stability there. All centers have to run and have to have quite heavy backup generators to make sure if any interruptions are there, there's continuous operations running. From a data perspective, I think we are at par. Definitely, I know from Kenya perspective, of course, you have multiple providers and you work around. There is still an issue, of course, on latency to the US because you going through different connections, which is a point that would be need to looked at and see how can we make that less impactful. Yeah.
JB, do you want to take us through this slide? Because I mean, there's a lot of interesting content in here, but it's from you, it's from your side of the pond. So walk us through it.
Yeah, I mean, I will say infrastructure is not on here, and government incentives aren't on here, but they could be. I think the biggest thing continues to be when corp dev or like location experts inside of large global services businesses are looking across at the location strategy, a lot of them aren't even looking at Africa, and if they are, it's only at South Africa or it's only at Egypt. And so addressing negative perceptions about I think certainly about infrastructure, but also geopolitical stability and just continuing to you're already seeing a good rhythm of things going out from the industry just to basically this is not an industry, I've said this before, it's not really an industry that tolerates like a lot of ambiguity or uncertainty. And so unless you're a real pioneer cowboy entrepreneur, like you're not going to go and try and scale a 10,000 seater, I won't say a country, but in a country that you perceive as doesn't have great infrastructure or is going through a coup or something, right? So negative perceptions is massive, and there are some things being done by that. I think I think companies that have operations in multiple countries, they do a good job. Mastercard Foundation is now entering the space. They're aware of this. But then you have to then, as a country, um, one company is not going to solve the jobs problem. And so as a country, there needs to be usually in Rwanda, it's RDB. In Kenya, it's Keninvest. In South Africa, it's a combination of BPESA and the DTIC. You have to have a coherent strategy on a country level where you can go and really, go head to head against the investment promotion professional from India or the Philippines and make a case. And it needs to be throughout, everyone's singing off the same sheet of music. Not a lot of data, right? So it's still, especially as you get into peri-urban or rural areas, there just needs to be more data. There needs to be more platforms that make talent accessible. Skilling
When
programs I've already
uh,
mentioned need to be more
you talk
demand-led.
about
Go
a
ahead.
lack of, sorry, when you talk about a lack of data, what sort of data would the market or prospective investors be looking for to try and make that decision on should we
Yeah.
invest in this space or
Uh,
not? Because the
hmm.
counter argument, I guess, some would make is, well, if you're looking for data on Kenya's macroeconomic environment, relatively speaking, we're
Yeah.
at par with South Africa, Egypt, probably not Nigeria. Nigeria might be on a different level altogether. Um, so the information might be there, but what are the gaps that you hear from, rather you hear from investors saying, well, we don't know about X.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking to decision makers, it's going to be mostly about once you bring them down from the ledge of, oh, it's going to be dangerous or whatever, or I'm not going to have power. Once that you get, that's just table stakes, right? But then it's all about costs and also, creating an easy way for them to have, a talent pipeline. But yeah, usually it's about cost. So like, fully loaded costs for seats. If you in a previous slide, the one that's called Africa's value proposition, right? It goes through those costs, and that's really what decision makers need. It's on the left. So you can see that Kenya is actually a little bit more expensive, fully loaded and this is for contact centers, than Egypt. But it's very competitive. Philippines would be like probably right on par, a little bit above Kenya. And then data on, just basic like networking data, like who do I talk to? If I want to open up a center in Ghana, who do I talk to if I want to, and just consistently pushing out and rankings too, rankings from CSAT scores and that kind of stuff. But is a wealth of data coming out of Asia on their sector, and Africa hasn't so far, had enough of that, nor is there an easy way, I would say, to access talent. Not an easy way. It continues to be a place outside of those mature countries where you can do amazing, but it requires, and Sven can tell you this, he's been through the journey as well, just requires a little more elbow grease, right? It requires a little bit more networking, a little bit more sitting in government offices sometimes. So it's yeah, there's some gaps, but I've seen them bridged a number of times by a number of people, but it's still early days.
Yeah.
Sven, do you want to tell us those war stories? Stories from the
No more.
trenches.
So I just want to go back, and I think if we're talking about data, I think there's, of course, this part that JB is referring to. I think it's also about government data. Yeah, what exact amount of graduates do we have in each individual sector? What talent is there coming out of the universities? What is the exact population consensus currently? Yeah, we are just these are certain aspects that are very detailed in Asia, in India and things like that, because it gives you the opportunity to literally target certain parts of a city, for example. But yeah, that's on the aspect of data for me is important that we get really concise and accurate data, which we can be presented to possible investors. On the war stories, Rama, of course, because it's emergent, and I can talk about Kenya, you have to get an understanding. There is still, I meet with people and I say, I work for a BPO, and they go, what is that? Yeah. So what is business process outsourcing? So the educational part of what our industry is actually about, the misconception of the working conditions, the misconception of the locations, how the industry is perceived. Like I said before, this is a industry which can explode on an opportunity of job creation. Yes, but it needs to be accepted and it needs to be understood what and how it works. I said it is a good jumping board for somebody to grow in our industry or move on to the next job. It is a 9 to 5 or a 24/7 shift pattern, coming on time, having a attendance, having adherence, getting that experience. Yes, I have been employed for the last 2 years for a global operator. I have performed well. So that is the war stories. How can we build that confidence in government, in the public, in what our industry actually is, and how it can support the country and the continent actually grow?
Before I get into the government incentives, one more point on infrastructure. And from your experience, I'm keen to figure out how this works. We had a bit of a dip in construction of data centers around the pandemic years. So I think 2022, 2023, thereabouts, obviously partly because of the pandemic. But with respect to where the data centers are concentrated on the continent, it's mostly Egypt, South Africa, um, Kenya, not
Nigeria.
quite as much, and Nigeria as well. Um, is there a correlation between, investments in data centers and, the growth of the BPO sector? Because, for some of the things that you're talking about, for example, Jonathan, the cloud tech skills that we need to develop, moving some of those operations over here. Obviously, we do need to be developing and investing in some pretty serious data centers across the board. And yes, Microsoft is doing their bit with that massive investment that they're doing at the moment, but more is needed, isn't it?
Yeah, I just want to clarify that BPO is generally, looked at as, sort of back office work, call center work. It tends to be entry level to intermediate level skills, but massive employment creation, right? And then you have IT enabled services or ITO, right? And now you start to get into, if you look at what a company like Infosys offers, right, which is a $73 billion market cap company, right? One company that has, 3 or 4 times the revenue of the continent of Africa, right? They also operate a little bit in Africa. But then you're getting into, ITO. Those two things comprise the global business services sector, right? And that gets you to the 1.2, $1.5 trillion number. So if you want to go up the stack and you want to have people earning $5,000, $10,000 a month on the continent, you eventually have to have those are the kinds of companies that will need compute, right? And Africa is, woefully behind on computing power, and of course, obviously that relates very much to machine learning and AI. But in terms of like basics needed for an ITO company to come in that's not, an AI specific company that's already there. I mean, Helios has invested in, I think, IX data centers, PAX, which is run by a Dutch guy. They've put a few data centers in, 50 to $100 million data centers. It's coming. But it is more on that really, really high level skills, and there'll be a slow maturation, especially in the emerging countries, from BPO to ITO to eventually having a sector that's comprised of both, right? So you can have a full career if you want to stay in tech, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it certainly does.
Okay.
Sven, you want to wait on this before we jump into the
Yeah,
incentives question?
yeah, I think India is a clear example of that, isn't it? I think India has really set the trend. I think, as JB is saying, our industry is the benchmark to start to be have that mass employment, and then you grow it to the next level. I think what India has done is the roadmap of how we should look at it.
Perfect. Just a small reminder to all the people on the call at the moment. If you've got any, questions, comments that you'd like us to cover, please drop them down below in the Q&A section. Should be on the bottom, essentially third from the right, on the buttons at the bottom of your screen. With respect to government incentives, I mean, Sven, I know you're set up at Two Rivers, and the way the Special Economic Zones Act tends to work, you've got a fairly fixed trajectory for what your tax policy looks like for the next 10 plus years. But what else would you'd like to see done to essentially enable this industry to scale?
I think that there are short term, if we would look at new investment, of more investment coming into the continent or the country, there are other incentives that other countries like Rwanda have done. It is a hard discussion because, of course, you want to grow the country as much as you need to grow the business. Yes. So to bring and to have a balance between the two, there are certain structures or models we could look at, but it takes time and a team to sit around the table and come up what is the best for everybody. I don't want to come here and say, okay, we want to do the same as, for example, Rwanda, where there's an exemption on PAYE, which sounds good, but that, of course, has a counter impact on, for example, Kenya as a country. So what and how can we develop something sustainable for everybody? Of course, the SEZ regime is a very welcoming regime. It is very well done at a terrific center. We also have an EPZ in Mombasa. The processes and getting through it is for me, simplification needs to be done. I think if we take the example, Ken Investor, RDB in Rwanda, I think RDB is much more proactive. I think much more faster in receiving the investment and collaborating. So again, for Ken Invest to sit with stakeholders of our industry and say, okay, how can we make this more attractive? The value proposition, yeah, for the continent. And how does it work for the continent? If I'm based in Kenya and I open a site in Rwanda or open a site in Ghana, how does the connectivity, how does it link to each other as a continent? Yeah. And then you come, of course, to the concept of the East African community and all that. So, yeah.
Jonathan, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean there are basics that that countries have to do. So an example for global companies would be transfer pricing, which is, unless you're in finance or whatever. I mean, but basically, it needs to be standardized at 5%. So if you have a company that's domiciled in the UK and you have a registered entity in Kenya, for example, you're not recognizing the revenue out of Kenya, but if KRA or whoever comes in and says, and that's very much what the legitimate way of doing it, right? You don't recognize revenue. You have your sales force, you have technology in the UK, and then you're using Kenya as a delivery location. Then those services have to be marked up. Anyway, it needs to be standardized. I'm not going to go completely into it, but that's a big one. And most countries don't have it standardized, right? Because they don't understand the way that the industry actually works. That's a big one. Work permits for easily bringing people in and out from. So if you have a team leader that is an amazing trainer in Manila, they should be able to fly into Nairobi for 2 weeks without a lot of headaches on, immigration and long processes. There needs to be a pro BPO government unit that you can reach out to. You want to know anything about the industry, but also that can, that's pro BPO and is saying that very loudly to the world. There's going to be winners and losers on the continent. There already are winners. Hopefully, none of the countries will be losers, but it's like anything. It will be competitive, And you have to do those fundamental things. And then you have some countries that go really big or have really interesting programs. So South Africa for years has had the government literally will pay on outcomes to companies for creating jobs. Um, that's just one example. Others have really aggressive corporate tax holidays. And it depends on the obviously the trade-off between tax revenue and employment growth. But ultimately, if young people are not employed, you have big problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the end of the day, that the fact of the matter is, having that clarity on policies and saying, look, if we ask for these specific things, for example, if we want to say we'd like these specific set of, clarity on policy, clarity on tax policy, and in exchange we aim for these specific targets in South Africa, like the South African example you just given, Jonathan. I mean, we could, I think, replicate those in our markets in East Africa, right?
Yep. Yeah, there are playbooks galore if you know where to look. And you don't have to do copy paste. Everybody has to run the cost benefit analysis for their own country. But yeah, it's South Africa, NASCOM in India. These are really great examples that if you just want to do the fundamental things first and see how it goes, that maybe don't cost a lot, but really show the world that you're ready as a country to grow this industry in your country, then that there are basic things you can do, and then there's more innovative things, but it's all available. It's just a matter of having engaged stakeholders within government. Right now, I'm working a lot with Ken Invest, and they're great. They're going to prioritize the sector in Kenya, and it's the same with the GBSGI in Rwanda. It's the same with BPESA in South Africa.
Yeah, I do have to say the Kenyan government has been very proactive in supporting on all the proposals and the discussions. Keep the traction. I think that's the key here, is keep the movement, keep driving, and create a value proposition for the country, and then look at the further continent. How does it impact the rest?
We're getting into sort of into the neck of the deep into the weeds of the budget making cycle. So the finance bill will be coming to Parliament, I believe, sometime probably in May. The target usually is to have it ready by the end of April. But given everything that we've seen, and statements from cabinet yesterday saying they were going to make substantial revisions to our spending plan, obviously that may get pushed forward a little bit. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, we're sitting down with the finance ministry and we say, look, these are the things that we would like to see, at least in the short run, in the 2025 finance bill. From your perspective, Sven, what would be on that list?
Um, I think transfer pricing is one of the main ones. I think we need to have some clarity on it. Of course, there are points that we could talk about, PAYE, discounts, things like that for the first 1,000 you scale or something like that. These are broad-based, and we have had these discussions already with government. So you can ask. Yeah.
Can ask, but delivery is, of course, a whole other story.
I think and Jabez can expand on this, but we have been in these discussions now for the last year and a half, I think. So it is just about getting, what is the value proposition for Kenya? What is the value proposition? What's the cost benefit analysis, and how can you make it work? That's the question. And I think till we get to that point, it won't get any traction.
Indeed. Jonathan?
Yeah. Yeah, I have a 25-page policy memorandum on this topic if anyone wants to read it. But look, I think it's those. We already talked about transfer pricing. I talked about work permits. I'd love to see pro job creation things, like if you're running a BPO over 100 people, you get these enhanced income tax holidays, full stop, for the next 10 years. So you can just build, right? These are, pro job creation. The tax base will increase because of people that are actually employed in an industry that's growing at almost 10% globally year over year. It's one of the few. I'd love to just see more incentives for the industry overall in over the next 5 to 10 years. That's what's worked. That's what's worked. It doesn't work to sit back on your heels You have to be on the front foot. That's what the Philippines did with their enhanced SEZ policy during COVID. You see the countries that get a little bit more stringent or clueless, and they're just an also ran within the global. But look, you're competing against some of the absolute strongest countries, in the world in this industry. You cannot afford to sit back. Companies are not going to come to you. Absolutely not. Because they're actively being sold to by Colombia, Mexico, even Sri Lanka, Cambodia. Like it's endless, right? So you have to be a little bit aggressive, and I'd love to see a carve out for you can't just talk about how we're the Silicon Savannah in Kenya or even in Africa anymore. You need to get very specific so that the people making decisions can say, oh, they understand my industry. They understand what I'm getting in Colombia. They understand what I'm getting in India, and they've matched it or they've bettered it. So those are really, really, it's a very important mindset shift.
Indeed. There's a question here from, let's see, this is Samuel Kiriga, who's asking, he says he's a founder of McDorsey Solutions. It's a BPO and IT provider here in Kenya, based in Westlands. He's asking about bringing demand to Kenya, especially for startups in the sector. What's the best way to do that, or how will such startups connect, right, to global source markets? And I think this sort of loops back to one of the things you talked about a little earlier, Jonathan.
Yeah,
How do we connect? How do we convince companies to come into Kenya to essentially outsource some of those services, back office
yeah,
process, IT stuff, to markets here?
yeah.
What
There's,
do you
yeah,
market?
totally. There's a lot of different ways you have to. It's like anything when you're, why do most businesses fail? They fail because of lack of sales, fundamentally, right? And so how do you actually get that demand? For one thing, air cover is important, meaning that whether it's PS Tanui out there talking about pro BPO policies, or whether it's MasterCard Foundation saying we're going to pump $100 million into the sector to promote Africa and promote the youth, you need air cover. On a day-to-day operator level, you have to make sure that you have your certifications, that for whatever industry you're in. So whether it's an ISO certification, whether it's GDPR compliance, going through SOC 2, having a strong InfoSec, that tends to be one thing that holds local companies back. The other is got to hire somebody that has connections to, if you want to sell into Sweden, and you don't know anybody in Sweden, good luck. They have their own industry. It's the same in the US, it's the same in UK. And so you have to, really, really define and productize your offerings and then have a strong go-to-market strategy. And that stuff, look, most startups fail. End of story. I mean, that's the way it will be. It always will be, unless you find strong advisors. You have a strong go-to-market plan, strong products. And so I would love to see from global investors more investment into what I would call local operator capacity building, because you can create jobs by teleperformance coming into your country, but wouldn't it also be nice, right, if homegrown BPOs and ITOs, like for example Technobrain in Kenya, could ultimately be creating jobs alongside the transplates that come in.
Sven, the next question, I'd like you to tackle it. This is from Paul Atwine. He's the founder of SEEV Africa. His question is an interesting one. Has a business case been made for BPOs in the sports and creative industries to set up shop in Africa, especially here in East Africa?
The sports and creative industry. So there is pipeline for that, and there is a review on it. If we are talking the creative industry, sports, the regulations, let me go there. I think that's the main difficulty, and we have not tackled it ourselves yet. So no, I cannot provide any more data on that.
What problems are there in terms of regulations exactly?
I think we're definitely looking at the gambling regulations and things like that. For us, we try. We are very strong in BFSI, for example, banking, financial sector, and insurance, which has got a clear, defined policy structures, regulations. I think there is still too much uncertainty how all that on sports and entertainment is actually developing in the continent. Yeah. So for us, it's a bit of an uncertainty and unsure terrain. So I'd rather not go into it. Yeah, and I think that goes back to what JB was saying previously. It's all about compliance. Okay.
Yeah,
It's all
yeah,
about
absolutely.
compliance, compliance, compliance. Our industry is probably, like I said, we do BFSI. So it's the compliance and the adherence to policies and procedures is so important. And if there's any air of uncertainty, we would not be engaging in it or not doing case studies or further exploring. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, you don't the last thing you want, as a BPO operator is, you set up shop, you've got, 500 seats or whatever the number might be, based on policy that's going to change 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, which unfortunately in our case has certainly been a bit of an issue here. Um, there's an interesting question here, which I guess might lead to future business. Who knows? Leo Waithera is asking, how can Grant Thornton, I believe that's a financial services firm, collaborate or engage with TP and Genesis? Jonathan, I believe that's aimed at you.
Well, yeah, I don't know about TP, but I think that the most obvious way, right, is when so it has happened more behind the scenes over the last 10 years where a lot of global operators come in and the red carpet is not rolled out for them. They have to kind of figure out, what to do, who to talk to. And I think a company like Grant Thornton, could offer a wealth of advisory services and, explain the real estate market, explain tax audits, et cetera, et cetera. Even perhaps recommendations around, HR, payroll. Do you use KPMG? Do you use this? Do you use that? These are the kinds of things that stop companies from actually setting up in Africa. They have to have answers to
I
those questions or it ain't happening.
and sorry, JB, just to add to that, I think the ease of setting up business is key. And I think if we're looking at the continent, Rwanda has done an amazingly, exceptionally good job on that. Yeah, we were
Yep.
there to go. It is very impressive. So I think that we can learn on the continent from each other as well. We need to work together. There are, of course, we are competing, but if something works for one country, the other country should be looking of, okay, that is something that is attracting. So why not?
Yeah.
And something very similar.
Yeah, a bit of a clarification here from Les. She says, but with TP, she was talking about teleperformance. So my guess is at some point we'll probably have to take this conversation on email to get in touch with both of you or your representatives, as a case may be. Yeah, they expect an answer from Triffic representatives. They'll certainly be in touch relatively shortly. We're coming up very, very quickly on the tail end of our allocated time because we're about 2 minutes out to 11 a.m. Gentlemen, your closing views on where we go from here, because we've covered questions around investments in infrastructure, energy, data issues. We've covered questions around policy certainty as well. But if we have this conversation in the next 5 years, what do you think the BPO industry might look like, based on assuming that, the status quo remains as it is now, or we do make some changes and perhaps that spurs the growth of the industry over the next 5 years?
So I think if it stays as it is, it will. It has got traction now, so we need to make the most of it. I think we need to take the advantage of the attention that the Africa and the continent is getting for the moment. What do we have to do is to solidify and work on the plans. Many of that we have discussed. What's the strategy for the continent to go to market? What are the USPs? How do we make it easy? So if we do that, then we will be able to grow this industry and create these jobs. If we stay as is and the uncertainty, I would think probably other locations will start popping up, and if they do a better job, then it will move there. JB?
Jonathan?
Yeah, if if things stay kind of status quo, the rich will get richer, and South Africa will eventually have over 1 million jobs just there, and in Egypt and so forth. But I think there's momentum, but there's also a tremendous amount of urgency
Very
for countries to get their act together in terms of, there's 4 or 5 major sets of stakeholders. Somebody's got to coordinate that and make sure that incentives are aligned with reality. Somebody's got to be promoting the country well globally, right? Somebody has to create a platform like SA Youth in South Africa where the talent is relatively accessible. And so you have to coordinate and you have to have a sector master plan and not just the operators know what they're talking about in the sector, but everybody from the skilling orgs, to government, to investors. And that's what you tend to see in countries that have, $5 billion plus industries in the space. And Kenya, for example, is at like 700 or 800 million right now. Nigeria is at about 500 million, whereas again, South Africa is already 6 billion. So these are fundamental things. And I think you'll see more of a full stack, right? So that in a perfect world, in 10 years, you're getting really high level, maybe cybersecurity services from Ethiopia and maybe a great call center in Ghana. And you can kind of do everything within the realm of the continent. Because of the time zone, it is the center of the world. And so if you can get all your services from different countries and take advantage of various incentives, it should be a very mature ecosystem. I think it'll continue to grow really fast, but nobody knows what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years these days.
No, definitely not. There is one last question that's popped up in the Q&A, that Sven, I think might be right up your alley. For big BPO companies, is there an opportunity for them to outsource some of their work to Kenyan BPOs, in order to increase their sales instead of them actually just, setting up shop here? That's being asked by Nicole Kunter from Vizex Global. It's a BPO that's based here in Kenya.
Um, yes, I think yes, there are opportunities. Again, it comes back to compliance and it comes back to certification, SOC 2, ISO. All these need to be in place. I think that is the key aspect of our business. If there is availability and there is space and there is a good work team, any opportunity is worth discussing. But I think that's what, like JB was saying, where we get stuck normally is at that point. Yeah. And I think from a client perspective, they would not allow us to sub outsource or anything like that. There are, of course, contractual issues and things like that, but that is predominantly for me, the advice is really start looking into the needed certifications.
Indeed. And on that note, we'll have to wrap up this particular webinar. Gentlemen, it's been an interesting conversation. I hope it's been equally interesting and engaging for all of our viewers on this particular webinar. Sven de Korte is the CEO of Teleperformance Kenya, and Jonathan Beardsley, Program Director at Genesis, with us for the last hour, talking about how to scale the BPO's industry here in Kenya, and of course around the rest of the continent as well. If you've got any questions that you'd like us to cover that we didn't cover in this particular webinar, if you'd like to, get in touch with the team at Genesis or at Teleperformance, please reach out to the team at Trific, the Trific Special Economic Zone, sales at Trific, trific.co.ke is the email address. And if you want to, put them on the line, 0709 902 400 is the relevant phone number, 0709 902 400. From me and the team here, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.